Hello and welcome to the next film in this series about the historical use of runes and rune magic. My name is Alban from Northern Viking Silver, and today I'm going to talk about casting the runes to read the future. Now, perhaps the most popular use of runes in modern rune magic is casting the runes to read the future. We've got a lot of words for this idea. We've got divination, sortilege, augury, the oracle, foretelling the future, cleromancy. There are a lot of words for this idea, but what I would like to know is there any evidence that casting the runes to read the future was a genuine Germanic practice amongst the ancient Germanic peoples, or is it something that was invented by those 20th century runic occultists? Well, let's have a look. Okay, back to that book by Ralph Blum that I'm always referring to, the Book of Runes, where Mr. Blum talks about how you can cast the runes for divination and how this was an ancient practice. But as I said, most of this book is based on the I Ching and tarot cards, although Ralph Blum does quote a genuine ancient source, which is Tacitus Germania. Now, Tacitus is a Roman author. Writing in AD 98, he wrote a book called Germania, and this is a book that describes all the different Germanic tribes and their practices. Now, this sounds like a really great thing because this is somebody writing from the time about what was actually happening. But we have to be careful with Tacitus because he probably had never been to those countries himself. He was copying down what other authors had written before him, and they may not have been reliable, although we can also hope that he did speak to people who had genuinely been amongst the Germanic tribes. So, in his book, Germania, chapter 10, I think it is, he describes how the Germanic tribes read the future. I shall read it out to you, what he wrote. To divination and lots they pay attention beyond any other people. Their method of casting the lots is a simple one. They cut a branch from a fruit-bearing tree and divide it into pieces. These they mark with certain distinguishing signs, and they scatter them at random on a white cloth. Then, after invoking the gods with eyes lifted up to heaven, the priest of the community, if the lots are to be consulted publicly, or the head of the family, if they are to be consulted privately, take up 3 pieces, one at a time, and interprets them according to the signs previously marked on them. Is this a description of casting the runes? Do we have any other evidence that this was a genuine practice? This is a question that really fascinated me, especially after reading Ralph Blum's book. So I asked myself if there's evidence, if this was, even if Tacitus is telling us a genuine practice, this is the 1st century. Do we have any evidence that it happened 500 years later, or 1,000 years later, or 1,500 years later, or even that it continued up to the modern day? Well, let's have a look. I searched long and hard for this evidence, digging through dusty old books in the university library in my youth, following up any mention of runes in the literature. I couldn't find anything in the written sources between Tacitus and the 10th century. It's like 1,000 years of silence. But from the 10th century onwards, we have some Old Norse sources that are pretty interesting. So I started out by checking the Old Norse words for different words they used that could mean sticks marked for divination, just like Tacitus described to us. We have the medieval sagas, and they describe things called a bloat, which means a sacrifice. Literally, the word means blood. And at these bloats, blood was collected, and it was used to mark sticks or twigs or chips of wood. So, in these sagas, they use words tantalizingly like hlautviðr, which means lotwood, valtein, choice twig, blótspaun, sacrificial wood, or even spágandr, which means prophecy wand. These words are tantalizing because they're hinting that they're used for telling the future, but they don't actually describe how they do it. Beyond actually saying that these sacrificial twigs were used to sprinkle blood on the walls of a temple. So what I want to know is what these different things were used for. Luckily, there are a few references that give us a pretty good clue. So let's go to 13th century. Snorri Sturluson wrote a saga of the Inglings, which describes the Inglings, who were a people in the 10th century. In this saga, he describes how a king travels to a blot, and at the blot they cast the sacrificial twigs. Let me find the reference. The saga says, the wood chips fell in such a way that he knew he did not have long to live. So this seems to say that they're casting these wood chips as a way of reading the future. And now there's another poem, or a poem, in the Elder Edda called Velaspao. This translates as the Witch's Prophecy, or the Song of the Seers. This is a really cool poem, and it describes the whole of creation from its very beginning through to the end of the world. The god Odin raises up from the dead a dead prophetess, or vulva. Vulva is a word that means witch or seeress. He raises her up and he forces her to prophesy for him. She's unwilling to do this, but he forces her to do this, and she describes the whole of creation. And she describes, first of all, things that have happened in the past. So she talks about the coming of the Norns, and she says that they carved on a stave. What does this mean, carve on a stave? Why would the Norns carve on the stave? Is this a reference to runes being connected to destiny? Well, the poem continues, and she starts to mock Odin with news of his own death. She says the chain will break and the wolf will run free. She repeats it, hoping that she'll put Odin off and he'll let her sink back into death. But he forces her to keep on prophesying, and she tells how the whole world is destroyed at Ragnarok. But afterwards, after the destruction, a new world rises up, and some of the gods survive. One of the gods that survive is Hörnir, and she describes how Hörnir chooses sacrificial wood, and then the sons of the two brothers will find their home in the great heaven. A bit obscure, but what does that mean, choosing the sacrificial wood? Is this a way of Hörnir reading the future? It's a tantalizing hint. There's another book that has a really strong reference to the casting of sacrificial chips to read the future. And this is the Icelandic Book of Settlements, the Landnáma book, which is written down in the 12th century, and it describes the settlement of Iceland in the 9th century. So part of this book, 198, chapter 198, which gives you an idea how huge this book is, it describes how a man called Onund beat his neighbour Eric to making the first claim for a piece of land. So Onund, this is what it says in the saga. When Eric was going to take possession of the valley to the west, Onund cast the sacrificial chips to find out when Eric would set out to make his claim. Because Onund cast these chips, he knows when Eric sets off, and he gets there first and gets the claim before him. So this is a reference about the casting of these chips, these pieces of wood, to read the future. Now, is this enough to conclude that what Tacitus describes in the 1st century has continued for 1,000 years and is being used by the Vikings and is actually being remembered into the Middle Ages when people are writing down sagas? And what about the practice continuing after the Viking Age? Is there any evidence for that? Well, I did find something. Let me show you my dictionary. This is a proper fat dictionary. In fact, this dictionary is a special dictionary because it's a condensed dictionary. It should actually be this big, but this huge set of books has been shrunk down into 2 volumes. And these volumes are full of words that are so tiny they cannot be read by the naked human eye. But what it means is that this contains a huge amount of information. If you have the handy looking glass, magnifying glass that comes with the dictionary, you can read all these references. Now, the reason the book is so huge, the books are so huge, is because these kinds of dictionaries record all the uses of words through history. So they'll record a word that's first written down in maybe Anglo Saxon times or Middle English times. And this is the place I started to look for traces of words for rune sticks or casting runes that may have survived. So I started looking at the word kefil, which is the Norse word for twig, and it's usually connected with the word for runes. So it's a rune twig. All those messages written from medieval Norway were called runakefli. So this word kefil survives in English and Scots dialect as the word cavil. And cavil normally just means a lot, something used for casting a lot. So the old usages describe how miners would cast the lots to decide who got to dig out which bit of the coal seam they were working on that day. But there are a couple of uses that refer to this casting of the cavils as a way of reading the future. A couple of obscure uses, let me tell you about them. So there's a book from 1475, Thomas Wycliffe's Apology for Lollard Doctrines, and in this book he writes that they finally settled their sortileges or prophecies by casting the cavil. And then, even more excitingly, I found a line from an English translation of Virgil's Aeneid, a translation from the year 1513, where the Latin word for oracle, which is source, is translated by cavil, showing that by this time they still remember casting the cavils as a way of reading the future. So yes, this is the result. It shows that this practice of casting pieces of wood with signs marked on it had actually continued, or at least been remembered, into the 15th century. So to sum up, after looking at this old Viking Age poem, Velaspao, and looking at the references from the medieval times and then these late medieval English references, it seems pretty clear that sacrificial twigs were marked with blood, then cast like dice and chosen as a way of reading the future. But frustratingly, it doesn't say anywhere that the marks on these pieces of wood were actually runes. It's like the sources skate around the subject, but they never actually hit the nail on the head and say the marks are runes. But can we assume that? It seems like a fair assumption to make. So that's the evidence I've gathered for the casting of runes being something used in historical rune magic. In the next film, I'm going to look at actual runic inscriptions, magical inscriptions from historical times. See you then.